This is Al Black and Chewing the Gristle with my co-host, the poet Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Al, how you doing today?
Wonderful. The weather here in South Carolina is delightful. Our poet today is Baruch November. Welcome, Baruch.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Baruch November recent full-length book of poems published by Main Street Rag in 2019 is entitled Mitzvah Dreams. His earlier collection of poems entitled Dry Nectars of Plenty co-won Big City Lit's chapbook contest. His poems and short fiction have been featured in Patterson Literary Review, Lumina, New Myths, The Forward, and Jewish Journal. He has an MFA in poetry from Sarah Lawrence College. For more than a decade, Baruch has taught courses in Shakespeare, poetry, and writing at Touro College in Manhattan. He has lived in many cities in the United States, but currently resides in Washington Heights, New York. Again, welcome, Baruch.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your journey in poetry and who were your influences and how you came to be a poet.
Well, I'd say my mom says my journey as a poet began in kindergarten or first grade when I wrote a poem about a chicken. I don't know about this poem. I've never seen this. I don't remember this poem. There's no record of this poem, but that's supposedly the first poem I ever wrote. And I wish I had it to share with you guys, but I'm not sure of its quality. Anyway, I didn't really write poetry much through elementary school. And then in high school, I started dabbling a little bit, but I didn't really take myself seriously. I liked music lyrics at that point, and I liked Shakespeare, and I liked literature a lot. I really started getting into literature in high school, and that influenced me. And then in college, I took an intro to creative writing course, and the teacher really encouraged me. And she really, she wasn't even, it's not fair to her, but I can't even remember her name, but she really gave me confidence in writing. I wish I could say I remembered her name. She was just a graduate student, and I really connected with her, and she really made me feel like writing was my destiny. And then after I took her course, I took courses with Ruth Stone, the poet Ruth Stone, and she also really nurtured my writing. She really encouraged me and made me feel like I had something to offer the world of poetry. Influenced by her works at the same time, as I was in her class, I started digging into her works, and I really respected her, what she had done. And I started reading poetry a lot more in college, reading it widely. And I started reading Rilke and Paul Celan and people like that, and grew to love poetry. Like I really, because these teachers took me seriously, I took myself seriously. And I think that that's a really important thing for an emerging poet, to not see poetry as just a hobby, to see it as something that is part of your life, more than just, maybe even a way of life, more than just something you dabble in. You got to get to that point where you call yourself a poet, and you do it. You do it as much as you can. And I think that that's really that for me, finding that seriousness is what really got me to the next level. And sometimes it just takes the right teachers to unlock that in us. I'm not sure if it's only talent that you need. I think you need other people. You need a network of people that support you. And I think it starts with teachers. So after that, after being encouraged by those teachers, I applied for graduate schools, and I went to Sarah Lawrence College, and I was heavily influenced by my teachers there, who also really encouraged me. Thomas Lux was probably the biggest influence, but also Stephen Dobyns. Both of them were really good teachers and really brought out the best in me, and I'm thankful to them too.
And those are great poets. So
Yeah,
really
yeah.
fortunate. I'm like you. A poet needs help along the way. Talk about your collection, Bar Mitzvah Dreams. Can you talk about the collection a little bit and its cohesion and how it came about?
Bar Mitzvah Dreams is a collection of poems that were written over a long span of times. Like there's a poem in there that's from like 20 years ago that's in my original chapbook. So it really covers the last. There are poems in there, like there's just one poem there from 20 years. A lot of the 20 years ago, a lot of the poems are from like the last 5 or 6 years, and it's really it's a mixture of single poems and 2 series of poems. One series is a series of dream poems, and one series is a series of beard poems. And the beard poems were inspired by the idea that in Jewish tradition, a beard is a symbol of compassion. So that's why rabbis have beards. Mystically speaking, that's why they have beards. And so I was really interested in exploring beards. And I also found it kind of interesting, like just this, like, I don't know, I found it quirky, a quirky thing to pursue, a thing that you don't necessarily see people talk that much about. And I that for me is the strength of that book, the beard series, for me. But the rest of the book I'm proud of too. I worked on it for a long time, and I revised it so much over the years that I worked on it. I revised it so much, it almost feels like someone else wrote it, if that makes sense to you. I did so much work on it that I can't even, like, I feel like someone else did it, because it's just, I can't even believe sometimes that I wrote it. I can't. Sometimes it's hard to just realize that you have a book, and it's like such a great feeling to have a book that you almost feel like it's not yours. It's like it's something that is so unbelievable.
It's sort of the mysticism of the muse, a little bit,
Yeah.
That I think that I'm hearing. But in terms of your poetic style, can you describe, what your style of poetry is, whether it's lyric, narrative, free verse?
I'd say my style is probably like free verse, and a mixture, like it's free verse narrative. I sometimes engage in the lyrical. I wish I did more. I actually wish I was more lyrical. My ideal is a merging of the lyrical and the narrative. That's my ideal. Whether I did that in Bar Mitzvah Dreams or not, I don't know. But that is, to me, that's the ideal poetry. The lyrical mixed with the narrative, the story with the sound, and the story with the beautiful images, and I think that's the strongest strongest type of poetry to me. The sort of, especially the image is very important. I think having distinctive images really pulls people in, and beautiful language is also really important. And I think like Bar Mitzvah Dreams is a mixture of narrative poems and also some sort of abstract lyrical poems, along with humorous poems too, but humorous poems that sort of tell a story at the same time.
Well, can we get you to read a couple poems? And I don't want to push you in any direction, but I'm captivated by the connected bearded poems.
All right. This is the 9th poem in the beard series. Even though his beard may sharply point to the ground, it is the custom for students to rise up as a rabbi walks in the room. When I entered the class at the College for Jewish Women, my students also stand, taking my beard for a sign I deserve that kind of respect. Sometimes I let them believe it, and in the phosphorescence, the hair on my face quiets the room into a formal silence that lasts until a student's little red phone comes to life with a long-awaited call from a Brazilian fiance, his distant accent traveling all the way up from below the equator. I'll give you another beard one. You inspired me to share them. The Hasidic musician cuts off his beard, dyes his hair to match the gold of 1 million records sold, explains the love of the one above is not dependent on a thicket dangling down a Jew's face. He takes a long journey, revealing new songs to the old world, then returns to the crushed leather sofa of his living room. His little boy rushes into his lap, but where once the son had something to pull himself upward to kiss his father's lips, the father must now bend his love down to meet his son.
That's marvelous.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
So in terms of your poetry in that collection, what do you hope, what are some of the larger themes that you draw out in that collection? What are you hoping to have the reader explore of themselves?
I think one thing I really want is like the theme of compassion to come out. I want people to like realize that, to just realize how important compassion is. And I think a lot of the poems sort of exemplify that, the need for compassion. They don't outright say it in a didactic way, but I think that they kind of ask for it in terms of talking about suffering, people suffering. There are like poems about the Holocaust in there and poems about anti-Semitism. And I think those poems make people think about being compassionate more. And I think that that's an important thing for poetry to do in this world. And in my lectures, I often try to emphasize poems that do that. And I try to show my classes that these poems teach us to be compassionate and we need to be understanding of others. And that's what I hope my work does too.
The poems we've heard and the ones we've read tell us that, yes, compassion is very big for you. Let's talk about revision. Do you have a process or a formula that you use for revision, or does it vary? And how much revision do you do?
I end up doing a lot of revision. A person I have to really thank for help in terms of my revisions is my brother, because here's what happens. I write a poem, I get really excited about it, I think it's amazing, I send it to him, he takes it apart and destroys it to a degree, not in a mean way, but in a way that just lets me know that I need to do that there's quality there, but I need to work. I need to put it aside and come back to it, and keep on doing that until it's perfect, until it's great. Because why write a poem unless you're going to try for something great? That's one of the things that my brother, I've learned from my brother, is that really he edits so much, he puts so much work, he's so determined to get to the perfect poem when he's writing it, that I can't help but look up to that.
So aside from sending poems to your brother to tell you, well, it's a nice poem, but you're not there yet, do you have any process that you yourself use? What do you look for when you're revising?
The process when I'm revising, a lot of times I try my best to write the poem and then put it aside for a long term, and then come back to it with a fresh perspective, because that's really the only way that you see it. Because really, poetry, I think writing a poem is like creating a child. Not that I have any children, but this is what I imagine, that you have that child and the baby is perfect. The parents love the baby. As the baby gets older, maybe develops a drug habit, does some inappropriate things, the parent realizes this is not the perfect person. We need to do some work here. But it takes a while to get to that point. It might take till the child's 20th year, right? So the same thing with a poem. It takes you a while to have the distance from the poem to realize that you have to correct it. And that's really I think that's really the only way. Other things are useful, like reading it out loud. And, I think that having people to send it to, like I have other friends that I send it to besides my brother. I send it to another poet, a good poet, Joey Nicoletti, that I went to graduate school with, and poet Jared Harrell, and some others. Those are the two that I send it the most consistently besides my brother, and they're very helpful. But I think it's really an essential part of editing is having that other poet look in on what you did, because without that, you're stuck in your own view, and that we're too happy with what we create. We need to be broken down a little bit so that we can become even better.
Kind of like tenderizing a piece of meat.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way. That's a good way to put it. But then there's always the gristle in the meat, right?
And we chew it.
Yeah.
So, who are you reading now? Who's inspiring Baruch?
I'll tell you, to be honest with you, I'm taking a break from poetry because I need to recharge my batteries. Like, I'm reading the poetry that reading the poetry that I teach in my courses. So I'm still reading poetry, but I find that and maybe I should have, part of my creative process is taking these breaks from poetry so that I come back with a totally new view. But I can tell you, I was reading a lot of Yehuda Amichai, Adam Zagejewski. I still am reading Ruth Stone. I go back to like those that are my favorites when I get back into writing mode. I also I'm reading. I do read a lot of Shakespeare for the course that I teach. So that the sonnets, I enjoy reading the sonnets. I find them difficult to understand, and I love sort of figuring them out. And so that makes me always sort of go back to them since I'm constantly teaching them. But I also am reading. Let's see, what else? What else was I reading recently? Yeah, I think the really Adam Zagejewski and Yehuda Amichai I was reading deeply. Those are my two models for poetry, really, because Yehuda Amichai comes from like the Jewish tradition, and his poetry is lyrical and beautiful, and Adam Zagejewski is able to have a certain sort of combination of great imagery and narrative in his work, and also have a sort of light sense of humor in it, which I find very refreshing.
Okay. So
I started reading this poet, Jeffrey McDaniel, who I really like. And I've gotten lots of that was the last poet that I discovered that I've really enjoyed. And I've been reading a lot of his books, and I recommend them.
All right. Would you share a couple more poems with us?
Sure, I'd love to. I'm going to share a longer poem. This is about when one of my roommates, when I lived in an apartment with roommates, he burned down. He had a huge fire in his room. It's called Casual Incineration. Months after the attacks of 2001, I awoke in bed to ash suspending above, drifting slower than snowflakes. My door opened to a greater storm of smoke and ash that looked like millions of tiny, ragged newspapers with glowing orange tails. Oncoming death may have already been old news. If the unseen flames didn't get me, the mounting smoke would. Still, I checked each bedroom of my shared apartment until I found the darkest one, which held a pillar of braided white flames and sable smoke rising from a record player. My friend preferred vinyl music purity, and at dawn was mindless enough to leave his sopping towel over his great stereo setup, creating the essential spark. Before that morning, I wondered how people could ever be brave or terrible enough to annihilate by placing their own bodies in a plane like bullets in a revolver that spins till no one is left. My friend returned to his personal inferno, saw the craterous scarring he had done our apartment, and found me on the roof, unthinking, coughing black spit, staring over the infinite island city, the Hudson, the crying traffic. With a smile and his silver glasses capturing the sundown, he asked if I happened to see the bootleg album he had purchased the day before. So it has to be possible to casually incinerate men through habit and without effort, just enjoying life, listening to select songs. One doesn't need to ferment rage for decades, nor old wild lust for sacred desert lands. When I coughed into clear oxygen mask, the firefighter pressed it to my face, saying, "You should never have opened your friend's door. Could have been it. A backdraft, you're dead." I knew that, but needed to feel the very bottom of his bed for feet, and finding nothing there, I glared into the tall fire, outlined by the expanding darkness of its own smoke, and flung off the bed's wool blanket, suffocating the flames until they could no longer laugh at their own terrible joke.
It sounds like you were very fortunate you woke up.
Yeah, I was. I always remember. I would always remember my roommate when after he came to see me. He I couldn't believe he made a joke out of it, but in a way, I think that was the only way he could handle it.
Humor is when we start healing from tragedy.
Yeah. Okay, this is a poem about me and my grandfather. It's called Finding the One. It will happen when it is right, my grandfather comforted me. looking at the gold sedan idling in front of us. Just be careful of the women you trust. And maybe for a second, an ancient pain burst to life again behind the dark glasses he wore for driving endless boulevards of West Palm Beach, where heat rose, distorting the distances ahead, the past behind. But my grandpa loved the long drive without reason. Nat King Cole singing over the cold rumble of the AC. The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. My grandfather's voice softly echoing the dead singers. And once, stopping for groceries, we passed Wilt Chamberlain's cafe, and there behind a wide tinted window sat the owner, the towering champion, son of a welder. My grandfather urged me to get his autograph. I held out a pen, and while he signed, I wondered, was it as the one who had poured in 100 points in a single game against the defenseless Knicks, or the man who famously claimed to have enjoyed the beautiful bodies of 20,000 women? When he stretched his long arms to hand over the signature, the red words on his black t-shirt were revealed. Yes, I am, it said, and I was young enough to think someday, certainly someday, I could be too.
That's awesome. Let's dig into your craft just a little bit. Talk.
Okay, sounds good.
A little bit about how you do what you do, and in terms of the poetic elements you favor, you choose, you embed, infuse into your poetry. What are the elements you use, and what are the elements you sort of stay away from?
I got off, like when I was in college and graduate school, I was into rhyming a lot. And I really sort of veered away from that and got more into the narrative and into the image and into wording. And I mean, I just lost my taste, for rhyming and that kind of poetry. Because I really got into the idea of telling a story, and I really fell in love with stories. And I always liked reading short stories, reading novels. Like I came to that first before I came to poetry. But I think that still, like in reading those forms, reading poetry and short stories, I think I was still engaging in reading poetry. It's just prose, really, with hopefully at its best, it has poetic language in it. So that taught me also like how to use images and how to use beautiful language and how to tell a story. And I think that that's why I sort of returned to that. And I kind of always really wanted that. And I just didn't realize it during college and graduate school. Although in graduate school, I didn't always rhyme either. I wasn't writing so much rhyming poem either. Rhyming poems. I started getting off of that then too. From that.
Give us some thoughts about how you approach line breaks, openings of poems, endings of poems.
To me, I've always been obsessed with good endings. I always, maybe too much, maybe overly obsessed with endings, to the point where I really think about the ending more than anything else in the poem. And so having a good ending, unless it has a good ending, I kind of can't move on. And maybe that's a mistake, because there can be other great parts in a poem and you can kind of just fade away at the ending. But I just love a good ending. I love it in the real world too. I love it in movies. I love it when I'm reading a novel. I just feel like things are justified by their endings. And so that's what I obsess with in my poems. Having a good ending, having an ending that surprises, or lets the reader think, or has takes a new direction. And I really work on the endings, and sometimes I think I work on them more than I should, and should be working on the rest. But I think it's always good to be critical of yourself that way, and maybe I'm too critical of myself that way, but it helps motivate me to improve my craft, thinking critically about what I do. I also do like a good opening. I think when I was younger, I was more obsessed with the openings. And as I've grown older, I've become more obsessed with the endings. Maybe that's just life, you know? That's how it works.
Yeah, that's hilarious. What about line breaks? Couple
Line
thoughts
breaks,
on line breaks.
I really like try to have like line breaks that deliver new meanings to the reader, to create a rich sort of layering of expression. And I've always been interested in that, like just like delivering different possibilities through line breaks, different possibilities of what the poem is saying through line breaks, to me is a beautiful thing. And I've always sort of played around with lines that way. But I also like the idea of just sort of having natural lines that flow and can stand on their own without line breaks. I like that too, and I play around with that a little bit. But more so, I try to have line breaks that really enrich the meaning of the poem.
As a teacher and as a poet, are there resources that you use for poetry? You know, are there, you know, there are a lot of books where people like Mary Oliver has them, and a number of other people have books on how to write poetry. Do you use resources or advise your students to use resources?
Well, the truth is, I teach poetry as a literature, not as like a creative writing course. Mm-hmm. So I would use those books that you're talking about, Mary Oliver's books, and Goldberg also has a good book. But there are a lot of those books that are out there that are good. But I think personally, I find that the best way is just breaking down poems themselves, having good examples and learning from those examples, because that's actually a lot of times what those books do. They'll have a bunch of poems and they'll break them down for you, and they'll tell you what's successful in those poems and what to sort of model yourself after. And so that's what I do when I do find a poet in one of my classes. I'll try to encourage him or her to read different poets, and I'll give them suggestions of who to read, and based on what their writing style is. I find that that's the best. Those give them the best lessons. And there is a problem that some poets don't really read other poetry. They just write I don't understand it, but I come across that students who just write, they don't read poetry enough, and so I really have to encourage them to do that, to enrich their own writing.
Okay. I think for Tim and I, this series of interviews, although we both read a lot of other folks, it has really enriched our understanding and experience as poets ourselves. Tim.
Hey, Baruch, how can people get hold of your book? And is there, after you answer that, is there anything else you'd like to tell the emerging poet? And then we'll get you to read 2 last poems.
You can get my book on Amazon. Just search for Bar Mitzvah Dreams, and you'll find it. Yeah, I think that the important thing is to persevere and to realize that the process is really important and the process is rewarding. Whether your poems get published or not, that's not the important thing. And it's hard to realize that. It's hard to accept that because we really want our poems published. We really want to feel distinguished. We want the attention. But the true reward has to come from writing a great poem in itself. Whether other people think it's great or not, you can't control that. And you can't hope to control that. You have to just keep on writing and trying to make it as perfect as possible. And the reward is in the process. The reward is reading the poem and saying, I can't believe I wrote this. That's where the reward really is, because you can't trust the publishing process, unfortunately. You know, people have different tastes. There's politics involved. There's connections involved. So you've got to just love what you do and fall in love with writing it. And that's really what the important thing is.
Amen.
Okay, this poem, I wanted to read you one of a poem that I've never read before to any audience, and it's from the series of Dreams poems. Cellar floor cold under my calves, I studied the velocity of trains given to me for Hanukkah as they circled their counterfeit world mounted on plywood. One train bears the name Subjectivity in large letters outlined in flames along its side. It serves as the local, yet has been constructed for comfort. Namelessly, the other one runs express, but it might be called Objectivity, as it appears more trustworthy. If you asked its passengers about how it rides, they'd shrug, mumbling it is not in them to judge such things. Lights above flicker, shouts rise from little plastic bodies whose feet won't let them flee. Catastrophe takes form, head on. The two locomotives collide inside a tunnel, gouged in the dark foam mountain. A thunderous meeting of subjectivity and objectivity. The moved and the mover, the seen and the seeing, the island and the ocean remains hidden at first. A long hissing follows as if the mouth of a volcano has swallowed a glacier. The tunnel crumbles, and what is false burns away. The wreckage of two has been fused into something new, a key to the next world, or a body of truth about to speak. Okay, so here's another dream poem. Ignoring electric eels below her, the Cuban Jew swims a calm breaststroke over waves of pulsating starlight. Her white swimsuit becomes a digital screen playing out the endless history of heavy desire found in every man who has ever seen her. As she surfaces, droplets of water spin on her dark skin, flashing gold, silver, bronze, as if tiny lighthouses guiding men upon her terrible reef of rejection. Her swimsuit flares brighter until nothing else can be seen. It spreads into vast spiderwebs, flooding over the world, catching men like blind mosquitoes. It ebbs back into slick, dark ivy and crimson vines around her body until it binds our every thought to poisonous longing. Once laid out on the sand, the Cuban Jew throws her green towel up. It blooms into a parachute of flame, dropping me at breakneck from the highest point of dusking horizon, tangling hotly around me to burn everything out of me, like the very moment she demanded space from me, and a throbbing vastness of many universes spreads open between us, carved out by light years in icy darkness, a distance only God could dream of climbing.
We want to encourage our listeners to go on Amazon or Main Street Rag and buy Bar Mitzvah Dreams by Baruch November. Thank you for being our subject in our interview today. We're very happy that you graced us with your poetry.
It was my pleasure. This was a lot of fun, guys.